Hi, my dear friends. Allow me to share some words of Torah for Parshas Noach. After the great flood, Noach plants a vineyard. The very next verse tells us that he drank from the wine of the vineyard and got very drunk. This led to a shameful exposure of Noach to his sons and the unfortunate aftermath, as the verses relate. I've always read this passage as an expression of nihilism by a man who barely saved his world, but at the same time lost everything of his previous life and existence and lost all sense of future purpose. After the initial euphoria of leaving the ark and surviving the flood, imagine the vast emptiness and void that confronted Noach. Here was a man whose best years were behind him and who saw nothing ahead for his future. Could we really blame him for his ecclesiastical attitude that everything is vanity? This reading of Noach's actions in the verses is influenced by Rashi and the sages, who tell us that when the Torah states, Vayachel Noach ish ha'adama vayita karem, they translate the word Vayachel to mean that Noach profaned. They read the verse as Noach, the nihilist, being a man who profaned himself by planting a vineyard before other more useful crops, so that he could indulge in the gratuitous pleasures of the earth. That's why the verse calls him an ish ha'adama. He essentially gave up on any higher purpose. As Nietzsche famously said, if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. So many people who feel stuck in life and who can't find a purpose will often use drugs and alcohol to drown out the pain of a life left unfulfilled. And this seems to be what Noach did by getting himself drunk. Just parenthetically, this is often the political argument against creating too much of a welfare state for the lower class, in that those on the dole will often give up on themselves. We often do more harm by patronizing those who could and should help themselves instead. But that's another discussion. There's another tradition about this story, one which portrays Noach completely differently, in a more positive, even noble light. According to Radak and others, Vayachel does not mean that he profaned himself, but rather that he began something new, from the word ochila, that he's started something new that had never been attempted before. Up until this act of planting, people did not plant actual vineyards. They rather planted individual vines in the hope of harvesting some table grapes for their community. Noach innovated the use of grapes, not just for fruit, but for wine, which necessitated the creation of large vineyards, far larger than the individual vines that were planted for fruit consumption alone. Noach is called the Ish Adama because he was truly a master of the Adama, of the soil, a master of agriculture. This narrative continues a rabbinic tradition from the end of Parshat Bereshit, which tells us that Noach received his name, which literally means making easier, because he innovated plowing with animals to ease the difficulty and travail involved in cultivating the soil. According to this interpretation, instead of confronting the nihilistic Noach after the flood, we are confronting the Noach who wishes to rebuild and create a whole new world with even more amenities than before. But if so, then why did the story have such a tragic ending? Why did Noach's newfound approach to manufacturing wine, a beverage staple for most of human history, why did he end up with his degradation and cursing his son and grandson? The Radak answers simply that this story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of wine and of overindulging in intoxicating spirits. But to get to a deeper meaning, we'll need to reference the Jewish mystical tradition. The Zohar states that the vine that Noach planted was quite extraordinary. Of the various opinions of what tree the tree of knowledge of good and evil was in the Garden of Eden, one opinion is that it was a vine. Noach somehow obtained a shoot from this vine from the Garden of Eden and planted it anew. In the language of the Zohar, and I quote, Noach sought to replicate the original act of eating from the tree, but his objective was not to replicate Adam's sin, but rather to understand it and to rectify the world thereby. He failed, however. When he squeezed the grapes to make wine, he became intoxicated and he wallowed in his tent, because he could not withstand the great temptation of the tree, end quote. In the eyes of the Zohar, Noach viewed himself as a fixer, a rectifier of all that was bad and flawed in the world. He was able to rectify the product of the original sin to some degree by making the life of man easier, alleviating some degree of the farmer's sweat of his brow, and mitigating the curse that was placed on the soil when Adam ate from the tree. What was Noach seeking to rectify by replanting the tree of knowledge and trying to eat from it again? We are treading on very deep and esoteric territory, but allow me just a surface view of something that is actually much deeper. That same passage of Zohar, which notes that Noach failed, also observes that he was not the only person who tried to rectify Adam's sin and failed. Aaron's two sons, Nadav and Avihu, also tried to use wine as a means of approaching God and rectifying Adam's sin. According to rabbinic tradition, they drank wine before entering the Holy of Holies, but sadly, they too failed. And that is why they perished, as written in Parshat Shemini in the book of Leviticus. Adam's fall was based on the tree being this very powerful opportunity for reaching some level of spiritual greatness, but also containing some great inherent danger if not used properly. Wine represents this double-edged sword of utilizing a mind-altering drug to expand consciousness. The only problem with this kind of mind-altering drug is that if it's not used properly, it will have a negative effect. Alcohol has such a dual effect of both acting as a depressant and as a stimulant. It provides a euphoric feeling through releasing dopamine, while at the same time depressing one's physical senses and creating a feeling of disassociation. What Adam was trying to accomplish by eating of the tree was to somehow dissociate himself from his physical confinements in the hope of conjoining with God. He failed because he could not control the byproduct of that effort, which is to get trapped in the self-indulgent euphoria of the moment. Both Noach and Adam and Aaron's sons hoped that they could separate the good from the bad. They all tragically failed in this effort. It is not impossible to rectify original sin, but certain things can only be accomplished at the right time and by the right person. The higher the stakes, the more dangerous the effort. As the late comic Norm Macdonald described about the sport of cliff diving, where a diver jumps off a cliff and either parachutes or parasails downward, he said there's only two classifications in cliff diving. There's grand champion and then stuff on a rock. Or we can refer back to the first part of the quote we started with from Friedrich Nietzsche. He who fights with monsters must take care lest he thereby become a monster. But was Noach wrong for his attempt? It's very hard to condemn him for trying to make things better, especially at this particular juncture after the flood. Perhaps he thought that this was his role. Mankind is being rebuilt, and now that the restart button has been pushed, let's go back to the original beginning in the garden. Perhaps that's why he felt that he needed to replicate this story. But there's something more. I'm inspired by the news story that one of my favorite actors, William Shatner, has just announced that next week at the age of 90, he will be the oldest man to go into space on the Blue Origin rocket. I hope to share more about this later with you, as well as a note that I sent to Mr. Shatner on behalf of our shul. I'm sure Mr. Shatner's doctors have advised him against this, and that he's probably taking some unnecessary risks at his age by traveling at high velocities into outer space. I'm reminded of a statement by Rebbe Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari when he was challenged about his plans to make aliyah with the argument that it was too dangerous. He responded, if a person has made a reckoning in his soul, is thankful and satisfied with having lived what he has already lived, and dedicates the rest of his life to the fulfillment of God's will, then such a person may place himself in danger. I'm sure Will Shatner has reached the point in his life when he feels that space is truly, for him, the final frontier, and therefore feels justified in taking the risk. Noach, too, was at a point in his life when he perhaps felt that he had already reached the highest plateau possible, and that the only thing left for him to do was to rectify original sin. We should be both cautioned and inspired by Noach's efforts, even though they ended in failure. We should be cautioned to never fly too close to the flame of life, lest we get burned. But we should also realize that life is all about constant advancement and improvement. You are never too old for a new endeavor. What's on your bucket list? Start a new chapter in your life and conquer those things you had always hoped to do, but then life got in the way. May we all succeed and continuously advance until we reach the final apex of our individual and societal humanity. I hope we get to realize this, friends, very, very soon. May we see it b'mheira b'yameinu. Amen. Here's wishing you an amazing Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.